In the early morning hours of June 25th, 1950, the quiet hills of the Korean peninsula suddenly erupted with artillery fire. Columns of soldiers began moving south across a border that had only recently divided the country. Within hours, a regional conflict was unfolding that would draw in powerful nations from across the world. Yet the war that began that morning did not start suddenly. Its origins stretched back through years of occupation, political division, and the growing tension of a new global rivalry. In the middle of the 20th century, the Korean peninsula became the center of one of the most intense conflicts of the early Cold War. The Korean War, which began in 1950, was not only a war between two neighboring states. It was also a confrontation shaped by the rivalry between powerful nations and competing political systems that had emerged after the end of the Second World War. To understand why the Korean War began, it is necessary to look further back into Korea's earlier history. For centuries, Korea had existed as an independent kingdom with its own culture, language, and political traditions. Located between powerful neighbors such as China, Japan, and Russia, the Korean peninsula had often been influenced by regional powers, but maintained its own identity and governance. This situation changed dramatically in the early 20th century. In 1910, Japan formally annexed Korea and turned it into a colony of the Japanese Empire. For the next 35 years, Korea was ruled directly by Japanese authorities. During this period, many Koreans experienced harsh political repression, economic exploitation, and cultural restrictions. Japanese colonial rule attempted to reshape Korean society. Korean language and traditions were often suppressed, while industries and resources were organized to support Japan's expanding empire. Many Koreans were forced to work in difficult conditions in factories, mines, and construction projects. Others were recruited or compelled to serve in the Japanese military during the later years of the Second World War. Despite these pressures, resistance to Japanese rule never completely disappeared. Korean independence movements operated both inside the country and abroad. Activists organized protests, underground networks, and political organizations dedicated to restoring Korea's independence. The situation finally changed in 1945 when the Second World War came to an end. After years of global conflict, Japan surrendered to the Allied powers in August 1945. With the collapse of the Japanese Empire, Korea was suddenly free from colonial rule. However, the question of how the peninsula would be governed quickly became complicated. At the time of Japan's surrender, Allied leaders had not yet developed a clear long-term plan for Korea's future. In the final days of the war, officials from the United States and the Soviet Union agreed on a temporary arrangement to accept the Japanese surrender in Korea. To manage this process quickly, they decided to divide the peninsula along the 38th parallel. Soviet forces moved into northern Korea, while American forces entered the south. At first, this division was intended to be temporary. Both sides expected that Korea would eventually be unified and allowed to form its own independent government. However, the global political situation was rapidly changing. The wartime alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union was beginning to break down. Differences in ideology, security concerns, and political influence were creating tension between the two former allies. These tensions soon developed into what would become known as the Cold War. As relations between the United States and the Soviet Union grew more hostile, cooperation over Korea became increasingly difficult. In the northern part of the peninsula, Soviet authorities supported the rise of communist government led by Kim Il-sung. Kim had previously fought against Japanese forces as part of communist guerrilla movements and gained strong backing from the Soviet Union. In the south, the United States supported the creation of a separate government led by Syngman Rhee. Rhee had spent many years advocating for Korean independence and strongly opposed communist influence. His government in the South developed into a state aligned with Western political and economic systems. By 1948, the division of Korea had hardened into the creation of two separate countries. In the North, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea was established under Kim, Il-sung. In the south, the Republic of Korea was formed under Syngman-rhee. Both governments claimed to represent the entire Korean peninsula. Each believed that the other was illegitimate and that eventual reunification should occur under its own leadership. As a result, tensions along the border grew steadily. The 38th parallel soon became one of the most heavily guarded boundaries in the world. Armed forces on both sides conducted patrols, small clashes, and military preparations. Each government believed that the future of Korea depended on eliminating the rival state. At the same time, the broader Cold War struggle was intensifying. The United States was concerned about the spread of communism in Asia, particularly after the communist victory in the Chinese Civil War in 1949. Meanwhile, communist leaders in North Korea believed that unifying the peninsula under their government might be possible through military action. During these years, both sides strengthened their armed forces. Soldiers trained, weapons were supplied, and plans were quietly developed. Along the border, tension grew as small incidents and skirmishes occurred with increasing frequency. By the summer of 1950, the situation had reached a dangerous point. Political hostility, military preparation, and Cold War rivalry had created an environment in which a single decision could ignite a much larger conflict. Early on the morning of June 25, 1950, that decision finally came. North Korean forces launched a large-scale invasion across the 38th parallel, moving rapidly into South Korean territory. The attack marked the beginning of the Korean War, a conflict that would soon draw in powerful nations from around the world and transform the peninsula into one of the most heavily contested battlefields of the Cold War. In the early hours of June 25, 1950, the long period of tension on the Korean peninsula suddenly turned into open war. North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel in a massive and carefully planned military invasion. Thousands of soldiers, supported by tanks and artillery, advanced rapidly into South Korean territory. The attack came as a shock to many observers around the world. Although clashes had occurred along the border before, few expected a full-scale invasion. The North Korean Army, officially known as the Korean People's Army, had been trained and equipped with assistance from the Soviet Union. Many of its units were well organized and experienced, and they quickly gained the advantage over the South Korean defenders. At the beginning of the war, the South Korean military was not prepared for such a large attack. The Army of the Republic of Korea had limited heavy equipment and very few tanks. As North Korean forces moved southward with armored vehicles and strong artillery support, South Korean units struggled to slow the advance. Within only a few days, the situation became extremely serious for the government in Seoul, the capital of South Korea. North Korean forces pushed forward along several major roads and railways, moving quickly toward the city. Civilians began fleeing their homes, creating large columns of refugees moving southward to escape the fighting. On June 28th, only 3 days after the invasion began, North Korean troops entered Seoul. The city fell after intense fighting and confusion among the defending forces. Bridges across the Han River were destroyed in an attempt to slow the North Korean advance. But the destruction also trapped many South Korean soldiers and civilians who had not yet escaped. The fall of Seoul marked a dramatic early victory for North Korea. As their army continued to advance, the government of South Korea retreated further south. For many observers, it appeared that the entire country might soon be conquered. However, events outside the Korean peninsula quickly began to shape the course of the conflict. In New York, the United Nations Security Council held emergency meetings to discuss the invasion. The United States strongly condemned North Korea's attack and called for international action to defend South Korea. At that moment in history, an unusual situation allowed the Security Council to respond quickly. The Soviet Union was boycotting the Council because of disagreements over China's representation in the United Nations. Because the Soviet representative was absent, the Council was able to pass resolutions calling for member nations to assist South Korea in resisting the invasion. The United Nations soon organized a military coalition to support South Korea. Although many countries contributed troops, supplies, and medical assistance, the majority of forces came from the United States. American leaders believed that allowing the invasion to succeed might encourage further expansion by communist governments in other regions. American military units began arriving in Korea during the summer of 1950. At first, these troops faced enormous challenges. North Korean forces continued pushing southward, capturing city after city. South Korean and American soldiers struggled to slow the advance while trying to organize a defensive line. By August 1950, the defending forces had been pushed into a small area in the southeastern corner of the peninsula. This region became known as the Pusan Perimeter, named after the nearby port city of Pusan, which is known today as Busan. The Pusan Perimeter became the last major defensive position for United Nations forces in Korea. If this line collapsed, North Korean forces might gain control of the entire peninsula. As a result, soldiers from the United States, South Korea, and other United Nations countries worked urgently to hold the line. The terrain in this region played an important role in the defense. Mountains, rivers, and narrow roads slowed the movement of large armies. United Nations forces used these natural barriers to strengthen their positions while bringing in additional troops and supplies through the port of Pusan. Throughout August and early September, intense fighting took place along the defensive line. North Korean forces launched repeated attacks in an effort to break through the perimeter. Battles were fought in hills, villages, and river crossings as both sides struggled for control. Despite the pressure, the defensive line held. Reinforcements continued to arrive by sea and air, and the United Nations command gradually built a stronger and more organized army. While the North Korean advance slowed, military planners began considering how they might change the course of the war. Among those planning the next stage of the conflict was General Douglas MacArthur, the commander of United Nations forces in Korea. MacArthur believed that simply defending the Pusan perimeter would not be enough to win the war. Instead, he proposed a bold and risky plan that could completely alter the battlefield. His idea was to launch an amphibious landing far behind North Korean lines at the port city of Incheon, located near Seoul. If successful, the operation would cut off North Korean supply routes and force their army to retreat. The plan was considered extremely dangerous because the harbor at Incheon had difficult tides and narrow channels that could complicate a large landing operation. Nevertheless, MacArthur believed the surprise attack might completely reverse the momentum of the war. As September 1950 approached, preparations for the operation were quietly put into motion. Ships gathered, troops trained, and the United Nations Command prepared for one of the most dramatic military operations of the entire conflict. The outcome of this bold plan would soon determine whether the war would remain a desperate defensive struggle or whether the balance of power in Korea could suddenly change. In September 1950, the Korean War reached a dramatic turning point. After weeks of holding the defensive line around the Pusan perimeter, United Nations forces were finally prepared to launch a bold operation that could completely change the course of the war. General Douglas MacArthur believed that a surprise attack far behind North Korean lines could break their momentum and force their army into retreat. The chosen location for this risky plan was the port city of Incheon, located on the western coast of the Korean peninsula, not far from Seoul. The harbor at Incheon presented serious challenges for a large amphibious landing. The tides in the area rose and fell dramatically, and the narrow approach channels could easily trap ships if the timing was wrong. Many military planners believed the risks were too great. Despite these concerns, MacArthur insisted that the very difficulty of the landing would make it unexpected. North Korean forces were concentrating most of their attention on the front lines near the Pusan perimeter, far to the south. If troops could land successfully at Incheon, they would suddenly appear behind the North Korean army and cut off their supply lines. On September 15, 1950, the operation began. Warships moved into position and naval bombardment struck enemy defenses along the coast. Soon afterward, thousands of United Nations soldiers began landing on the beaches. The operation was carried out with remarkable speed and coordination. The North Korean defenders were caught by surprise. Their forces in the area were relatively small, and they were not prepared for such a large assault. Within a short time, United Nations troops secured the port and began moving inland. The success of the Incheon landing had immediate and dramatic consequences. With enemy forces suddenly appearing behind them, the North Korean army advancing near the Pusan perimeter found itself in a dangerous position. Their supply routes were threatened, and communication between units became difficult. At the same time, United Nations forces along the Pusan defensive line began launching their own counterattacks. North Korean troops were now under pressure from two directions. As their situation worsened, many units were forced to retreat northward in order to avoid being surrounded. In the weeks that followed, United Nations forces advanced rapidly across South Korea. Seoul, which had fallen at the beginning of the war, became a major objective. After intense fighting, the city was recaptured by United Nations and South Korean forces in late September 1950. The recapture of Seoul was an important symbolic victory. Only a few months earlier, the South Korean government had been forced to flee as North Korean troops entered the capital. Now, the balance of the war had shifted dramatically in the opposite direction. As North Korean forces retreated across the peninsula, a new question emerged. Should the United Nations Army stop at the 38th parallel, restoring the original border between North and South Korea, or should they continue advancing into North Korean territory? Political leaders in the United States and South Korea debated this issue carefully. Many believed that if the North Korean government remained in power, the threat of another invasion might continue in the future. Others warned that advancing too far could provoke intervention from neighboring countries. Eventually, the decision was made to continue the advance northward. United Nations forces crossed the 38th parallel in October 1950 and began pushing deeper into North Korea. Their goal was to defeat the North Korean army completely and reunify the Korean peninsula under the government in Seoul. At first, the advance moved quickly. North Korean resistance was weak after the earlier defeats, and many of their soldiers were retreating toward the northern mountains. United Nations troops captured several important cities and moved steadily toward the Yalu River, which forms the border between North Korea and China. However, this rapid advance created growing concern in Beijing. The leaders of the newly established People's Republic of China watched the situation carefully. Only a year earlier, in 1949, Communist forces under Mao Zedong had won the Chinese Civil War and established a new government. For Chinese leaders, the presence of United Nations and American forces approaching their border was alarming. They feared that if these armies reached the Yalu River, China itself might eventually face military pressure or invasion. Throughout October 1950, China sent warnings through diplomatic channels suggesting that it might intervene if foreign troops moved too close to its border. Many United Nations commanders believed that China would not actually enter the war, assuming that the risk of confrontation with the United States would be too great. However, events soon proved otherwise. In late October 1950, large numbers of Chinese soldiers secretly crossed the Yalu River and entered North Korea. These troops were officially called the Chinese People's Volunteer Army. Although described as volunteers, they were in reality organized and supported by the Chinese government. At first, these forces moved quietly through the mountains, avoiding large battles while positioning themselves along the advancing United Nations lines. Their arrival was not immediately understood by many commanders. Then, in November 1950, Chinese forces launched a massive surprise offensive. Suddenly, United Nations troops that had been advancing north found themselves facing enormous numbers of fresh soldiers attacking from the hills and valleys. The Chinese offensive dramatically changed the direction of the war. United Nations forces were forced into a difficult retreat as Chinese and North Korean troops pushed southward across the peninsula once again. What had seemed only weeks earlier like a nearly completed victory now turned into a new and uncertain struggle. The Korean War had entered a far more dangerous stage, one that would draw even larger armies into battle and extend the conflict for several more years. By the winter of 1950, the Korean War had entered a new and far more complex phase. The arrival of large Chinese forces transformed what had once been a rapidly changing battlefield into a much larger and more difficult conflict. United Nations troops, who had only recently been advancing toward the northern border of Korea, suddenly found themselves facing powerful counterattacks from Chinese and North Korean armies. The Chinese offensive began with surprise and overwhelming numbers. Soldiers moved through the mountainous terrain of North Korea, often traveling at night and using the landscape to hide their movements. When they attacked, they struck quickly and in large waves, forcing United Nations forces into a difficult retreat. Many battles during this period took place in extremely harsh winter conditions. Temperatures across the Korean peninsula dropped far below freezing, and soldiers on both sides struggled with snow, ice, and bitter winds. The freezing weather made movement difficult and placed additional strain on troops already exhausted by months of fighting. One of the most intense battles of this period occurred near the Chosin Reservoir in northeastern Korea. United Nations troops, including many United States Marines, found themselves surrounded by large Chinese forces. Despite the dangerous situation, these units managed to fight their way out while retreating toward the coast. The battle became one of the most famous and difficult episodes of the war. As Chinese and North Korean forces pushed southward, the city of Seoul once again became a major objective. In early 1951, the capital fell into communist hands for the second time during the war. However, the situation soon shifted again as United Nations forces reorganized and launched new counterattacks. During the following months, the front line gradually stabilized near the 38th parallel, close to where the conflict had originally begun. Although both sides continued to fight, neither was able to achieve a decisive breakthrough. The war slowly turned into a long and exhausting stalemate. Fighting continued across hills, valleys, and fortified positions. Battles often focused on control of strategic ridges and defensive lines. Artillery bombardments, patrols, and small assaults became common as soldiers struggled to gain even small advantages on the battlefield. At the same time, political leaders began discussing the possibility of ending the conflict through negotiation. In July 1951, representatives from the opposing sides opened peace talks in an attempt to reach an agreement that might stop the fighting. However, these negotiations moved very slowly. Disagreements about the exact location of the border and the treatment of prisoners of war created long and complicated discussions. While diplomats debated these issues, the war itself continued along the front lines. For the soldiers fighting in Korea, this period was marked by uncertainty and endurance. Many troops spent months defending trenches and fortified positions that sometimes resembled the battlefields of the First World War. Attacks and counterattacks occurred, but the overall front line changed very little. The war continued in this difficult stalemate for nearly 2 more years. During this time, thousands of soldiers on both sides were killed or wounded, even though neither side gained major territory. Finally, after long negotiations, an agreement was reached in July 1953. The Korean Armistice Agreement brought an end to active fighting. The armistice established a ceasefire and created a new boundary between North and South Korea that closely followed the existing front line. A heavily guarded region known as the Demilitarized Zone, often called the DMZ, was created along this border. Although it is called demilitarized, the area quickly became one of the most heavily defended boundaries in the world, with large military forces stationed on both sides. It is important to understand that the armistice did not create a formal peace treaty. Technically, the Korean War never officially ended. Instead, the ceasefire simply stopped the fighting while leaving the political division of the peninsula unresolved. The consequences of the war were enormous. Millions of soldiers and civilians lost their lives during the conflict. Cities, villages, and infrastructure across Korea were heavily damaged or destroyed. Families were separated by the new border, often unable to communicate or reunite for decades. For the wider world, the Korean War had a lasting impact on international politics. It demonstrated how the Cold War rivalry between communist and non-communist powers could erupt into violent conflict. The war also strengthened military alliances and increased tensions between the major global powers of the time. In the decades that followed, North Korea and South Korea developed along very different paths. South Korea gradually built a strong economy and later developed into a democratic society. North Korea remained under a highly centralized government and continued to maintain one of the largest military forces in the region. Even today, the border between the two Koreas remains heavily guarded. The demilitarized zone still separates the peninsula into two very different states, reminding the world of a war that ended without a final peace agreement. The Korean War may sometimes be called the Forgotten War because it is less widely discussed than other conflicts of the 20th century. Yet its effects continue to shape the politics, security, and history of East Asia. In the quiet mountains and valleys of the Korean peninsula, the traces of that conflict remain part of the landscape and memory of the region. The war that began in 1950 not only divided a nation, but also became one of the defining conflicts of the early Cold War era.